number 78 of the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs. We acknowledge we meet on the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. Pursuant to standing orders, we're meeting today in hybrid format. Lori, good to see you. And because we have Lori on the first panel, Ms. Idlut, sorry, I'm a bit informal here. You know how to run everything, so I won't go through all of the instructions. For the second panel, we have online witnesses, so I'll do a bit more of an explanation at that point. Now that we're in session, no photos are allowed, no screenshots are allowed, and we'll jump right into it. So I'd like to welcome our two witnesses today. We have, make sure I have the right witness list here. Shannon Metatawabin, you can help me. Metatawabin? Okay, thank you. And with the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association, so welcome. And Hayden King, Executive Director with the Yellowhead Institute. So, colleagues, we're going to have lots of time for good discussion today. Our first panel is going to be about 45 minutes. Then we'll have to suspend, bring in our second panel. That'll be about 45 minutes. Then we'll suspend and go into committee business for drafting instructions. So, witnesses, I'll give you 5 minutes for your opening statement. I use a handy visual cue system here, so when there's 30 seconds left, I'll give you the yellow card. When time's up, I'll give you the red card, but finish your thought, don't stop mid-sentence. We want to hear what you're saying. And we will get ready, or we're ready to go now, and then we'll go into our rounds of questions after that. So who'd like to go first? Very open here. We're a very friendly group. Okay, if you're ready to go, the floor is yours.
So I'm going to slow it down just a little bit.
Exactly. So that our staff will greatly appreciate that. And so the floor is yours. And when you start talking, I'll give you 5 minutes.
My name is Shannon Metatawabin, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association. I'm also a member of the Fort Albany First Nation of the Mushkegowuk Territory. I would like to thank you for the invitation to speak today. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded and unsurrendered Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. The National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association is a representative organization of over 50 financial institutions, Indigenous financial institutions, which provide developmental lending to hundreds of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis businesses across Canada. Indigenous businesses, both on and off reserve, face many challenges accessing financing for starting new businesses. The greatest impediment is the lack of modern on-reserve land regime that recognizes First Nations jurisdiction. In Canada, as in most of the developed world, a secure land base is a foundation of economic development. Land provides equity to allow access to financing for investment and entrepreneurship, a taxation base to promote community development, and a critical input for development of business opportunities in the range of sectors including natural resource extraction. The World Bank estimates that the real property represents between 1/2 and 3/4 of the wealth of most economies. When governed through the effective management and regulatory regimes, land is a primary driver of economic growth. The National Indigenous Economic Strategy, the first entirely Indigenous-led strategy for economic prosperity, identifies many of the challenges in maximizing land for economic development purposes: the high cost of businesses due to the cumbersome land management provisions of the Indian Act, restrictions on the sale and use of reserve lands, and limitations on the use of reserve land for collateral. I'll leave this with the committee so that you can use it. The strategy includes a comprehensive series of recommendations regarding land sovereignty, land management, and environmental stewardship. I invite your committee to reference this important document in your study. Indigenous financial institutions prove to be an important vehicle to overcome these challenges by providing financing to Indigenous businesses that would not otherwise have access to mainstream lending. The Indigenous financial institutions are an incredible success story. During a 30-year partnership with the Government of Canada and since 2014 delivering the Aboriginal Entrepreneurship Program, Indigenous financial institutions, with the help of modest federal subsidies, have provided over 52,000 loans totaling $3.3 billion in lending to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis-owned businesses. Each year, Indigenous financial institutions make between $115 to $125 million in loans, supporting about 1,500 businesses. Indigenous businesses are a clear driver of employment, wealth creation, and better socioeconomic outcomes for Indigenous communities. Every loan provides 3.34 jobs, increases in life satisfaction of 72%, increases in mental health indicators of 52%, and health indicators of 19.9%. However, since the 80s, the economy and the nature of business has changed significantly. Number of Indigenous small medium enterprises has been growing as a result of demographic and demonstrable success. Size of loans are increasing as a result of the growing businesses and expanding opportunities. Yet the annual federal funding has not increased in almost 20 years, and inflation has reduced its value. Current program resources do not allow Indigenous financial institutions to respond to these factors. 40% of Indigenous financial institutions are fully loaned out, and there is insufficient capital to respond to growing demands of Indigenous businesses. The National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association suggests that your standing committee take into account the challenges Indigenous people face without proper land tenure and call for additional funding for Indigenous financial institutions. Specifically, NACA has called for an additional $100 million annually of flexible funding to meet increasing needs of growing Indigenous business sector. Additional funding would result in an increase of $620 million to Canada's GDP, support 8,600 new business jobs, with resulting improvements in food security, mental health, and housing. During the last election, all major parties committed themselves to undertaking the important step of walking on the path to economic reconciliation. I'm here to suggest to you that the reconciliation is not possible if Indigenous people continue to be excluded from Canada's economy and from sharing in Canada's long history of prosperity. Indigenous nations want to end the systemic economic exclusion and be full partners in this confederation. This is what we mean by economic reconciliation.
Great. Thank you for your opening comments. And now, Mr. King, if you're ready, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Anin Bojo Ginawea. My name is Hayden King. I'm from Beausoleil First Nation on Chimnasing. That's a small island Indian reserve, Ojibwe and Potawatomi community, about 2 hours north of Toronto by car and by boat. I'm also the executive director of Yellowhead Institute, which is a research and education center based out of Toronto Metropolitan University in Toronto. My research and analysis revolves around the land. I am the co-author of the agenda-making report, Land Back. I study modern treaty implementation revolving around land and resources, and I work on re-articulating Anishinaabeg diplomacy and law around hunting and land management. So this is the context from which I speak to you all today. And I believe that any discussion of land back has to begin with a discussion of land theft. The demands that Indigenous people and Indigenous young people are making today for restitution are old calls. The oldest protest in the country is for the return of lands and resources that have been taken by hooks and crooks, as Descahe once said. The doctrine of discovery, that piece of international imperial law, was the foundation of the world's greatest plunder, and which Canadian courts have relied upon when hearing the first Indigenous land disputes. The doctrine of discovery declared Indigenous peoples inhuman, not worthy of rights, and certainly not worthy of property rights. When courts realized the basis of Canadian sovereignty might be questioned using this rationale, arguments for possession shifted to treaties. In other words, Canada owns the land by virtue of negotiating treaties. But this isn't quite right either. In Ontario, pre-Confederation treaties were sharing pacts that were almost nearly immediately broken and used to relocate Indigenous people, communities, and families. The people that call my community home, Beausoleil First Nation or Chimnasing, were relocated 4 times and pushed west and south to make way for settlement. Over the Great Lakes and into the prairies, the so-called Confederation-era numbered treaties followed the trend, as treaty commissioners promised one thing and enforced another, and that enforcement was buttressed and supported, upheld by public officials and the courts. As a common law legal infrastructure became entrenched in Canada, Indigenous people had few avenues to express the views that treaties were not negotiated to surrender or to cede, but to share in the spirit of mutual respect. It didn't help, of course, that the Indian Act made hiring a lawyer illegal. And elsewhere in the country, treaties simply were not made, which even by Canadian law, inherited from the English, meant that Indigenous people still had some form of title to it. Yet here too, Indigenous people have struggled to find an audience as the constitutional division of powers have carved up our territories and responsibility for them among the provinces, along with deploying the concept of crown lands. Today, when Indigenous people call for land back, especially in those areas where no treaty has been made, the federal government can conveniently hide behind federalism. And so in this atmosphere of fictive legal possession of Indigenous lands, how can we get land back? There are a variety of tools currently deployed, most commonly the specific and comprehensive claims processes, but they rarely transfer land. Instead, they provide compensation as a form of redress to buy land back, and in some cases, and this was the former Crown Indigenous Relations Minister's position on land back, turn it into Indian land via the additions to reserve policy. These tools are inadequate. Instead, why not a framework for the transfer of Crown lands, which rightfully are Indigenous lands, and related government-owned properties and territories back to Indigenous people? Why not perhaps a program to support First Nations with resources to develop a national land restitution center and innovate a tax-free way to reclaim land in fee simple? There are many private citizens and organizations increasingly keen to transfer those lands back to Indigenous people, but they lack the tools to do so. Building on models in modern treaty contexts, what about co-management regimes that eventually give way to exclusive Indigenous management? Or a renewed approach to criminalizing Indigenous people defending their land? Or the development of a framework to discuss what we mean by treaties and treaty implementation, both historic and modern? And why not in the interim, as we work all of this out, the deployment of free, prior, and informed consent? Something the federal government committed to in the United Nations Declaration Act Action Plan. While the duty to consult is limited and narrow, it is broad in scope, and perhaps maybe even through federal legislation, free, prior, and informed consent could be deployed and allow Indigenous people to have de facto authority and make decisions on their lands and territories and the resources that come along with that. Free, prior, and informed consent can unlock both land restitution and self-government, in fact. Now, regardless of what the federal government decides to do with this study or future policy or law, Indigenous people will continue to innovate, push, and enforce their own vision of land back, making it the next generation Indigenous rights paradigm. Ahaw, miigwech. We'll look forward to discussion.
Thank you for those comments. We're going to go right into our rounds of questions. So the first round are 6 minutes each for 4 rounds of questions. And I would like to also acknowledge the attendance of Mr. Shields and Mr. Hanley today. So welcome to our committee. First up, we have Mr. Vidal. And when you're ready, the floor is yours for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And I want to thank you to our guests for being here today. Appreciate your comments and your opening statements. I'm going to start with Mr. Metatawaban. A couple questions for you first. How long have you been the CEO of NACA?
7 years, going on 8, I suppose. It's been a long time.
It's been a while, right? You've been at it for a long time. And sorry, that's my point. I was looking at your website today, and it talks about your mission being to serve as the voice of Indigenous financial institutions and as a national advocate for Indigenous business development. Your vision, promoting thriving, prosperous Indigenous businesses with equitable access to capital and care. With that context, Mr. Metatawaban, we had earlier in the summer when we were working on the study, we had a fellow by the name of Mr. Sean Willie. Do you know Sean?
Yes,
From Saskatchewan? Yeah, yep. I think you would. Yep. He talked about some of the use of land by their First Nation in northern Saskatchewan, but he talked about it being used both in the north near their community, but also some of the work they did around the city of Saskatoon through there's an urban development there that they've had great success developing. And so I guess with all of that kind of context, my question for you is not that complicated. It's just how would you like to see First Nations utilize land restitution as a way of achieving economic reconciliation? Obviously, you've been working at economic reconciliation for 11 years as the CEO of NACA.
Yeah, and I actually started as a business development officer giving out loans because this whole program was created because our people can't access land to securitize any loans. So they weren't able to participate in the economy. And it's had quite a success, $3.3 billion in lending so far. Communities that are near urban centers or communities that can invest in purchasing land near urban centers are seeing great success. But they are still facing a lot of barriers, timing, lack of capacity, and support to ensure that they do proper due diligence on any sort of business opportunities. I was speaking with my brother who helped the Tsuut'ina Nation out of Calgary, and they invested themselves to ensure that their opportunity was well thought out, that they were ready to come to the table to work with the City of Calgary, the province, and the federal government to ensure that that program and that opportunity where you see the ring road finally going around the complete circumference of that city is realized. And now they're seeing some real benefits to that community. But the government did not make it easy for them. And I think that you have to release the shackles for Indigenous people to have some ownership and some jurisdiction to land. You heard in my opening comments, a half or to 3/4 of all wealth comes from land. And if we don't have any access to land, we'll never see any wealth. So we need to unlock those opportunities.
Thank you for that. Maybe just pursuing that conversation a little bit, I'll just dig into what you said. It's obviously no secret some of the challenges that First Nations communities are facing, whether it be healthcare, housing, education, economic opportunities, so recreation, there's so many different things. Can you maybe just flesh out a little bit further how you talked about unlocking economic development with land? How does that directly link back to solving some of these other challenges, I guess? Can you just flesh that out a little bit for us?
Well, without land, you don't really have a culture that has any hope of sustainability. Indigenous Services Canada still has discretionary spend on health, on housing, on everything that is Indigenous. There's no long-term planning. There's no long-term investment into that. It's a social spend, and there appears to be no way out of it. The only way that you can really think to get out of that is to invest into economic opportunities, which includes land. If you can invest into the community now, then you'll see a decrease in spend in the future because you'll have more opportunities like the communities that bought into the Clearwater $1 billion opportunity. This is a major industry. Canada is seeing the slowest growth in major projects and resource development in history, I'd say. Foreign investment is not coming to Canada because the uncertainty of the Indigenous community. Now let's provide that certainty back to investors that want to come to Canada, to want to partner with us to see prosperity for Canada again, but it's not going to happen without Indigenous prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you. I have just over 1 minute left, so I'm going to ask my question really quickly to give you a bit more time. I want to give you the opportunity to talk about maybe your Indigenous Growth Fund or your Aboriginal Entrepreneurship Program or the Community Futures Development Corporation and some of the challenges you may be facing as you go forward with some of those programs at this point.
Thank you for that. So we've been in place for more than 35 years. We have 58 financial institutions from coast to coast to coast helping Inuit, Métis, and First Nation entrepreneurs. So we incubate business. I call it the largest social finance network in Canada, if not the world. It's an OECD best practice that says that this is how Indigenous people should expand themselves. The government is launching a social finance fund that's going to be rolling out soon that by all indications, looks like it might compete with us a little bit because the market for that social finance fund is Indigenous business. We've developed this market for 35 years. We don't need competitors in this space. We've been asking for support through the Aboriginal Entrepreneurship Program to ensure that we have the right support, and because you need to invest into something in order for the money to be deployed. And we've always had a lack of capital. We created an Indigenous Growth Fund to be the solution for that access to capital by creating an institutional-grade investment tool to give private sector an opportunity to invest in our community because we give out those loans to our members, and our members give that to the entrepreneurs. But you have to enable that capital to get to that entrepreneur. And we have not seen an increase in that support. We're asking for about $100 million a year. that enables us to create and build out that ecosystem to ensure that we're given the opportunity to every entrepreneur that needs it. Now, half of our members are CFs, and right now the ISED is creating a barrier for our members to even use their loan portfolios to access our loan. So they helped us create it, but they're preventing us from having our members access it. So we need some help to have the minister allow CFs, Community Futures Development Corporations, to access our growth fund. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go now to Mr. Batiste, who will have 6 minutes.
Thank you for that, and I'd like to thank Mr. King for your history. I think you did a real good job of painting the picture of dispossession of Indigenous lands in Canada. With that said, my question is for Shannon. Shannon, when we started this study, the premise was that if we were able to restitute lands back to Indigenous communities, such as ATRs, additions to reserves, but also creating urban reserves in municipalities, that there's a strong business case that would not create decline in growth, but it actually would create more growth in Canada. You referenced Member 2 in the Clearwater deal. Member 2 is located in the heart of Sydney, Nova Scotia, and they're one of the largest employers not only of their community members, but in the Cape Breton Regional Municipality as a total. I'm wondering if you could speak to why is it a good investment to make sure that Indigenous communities have urban reserves and the kind of economic impact they can have for Canada as a whole if we were to use that model for success for economic reconciliation across Canada.
Let's remember that Indigenous people were separated from the market. We were placed on the individual reserves away from the market so that Canada could be prosperous and access all those lands. By being separate from the economy, we're in the situation where we are. Canada has people that are in poverty within our nation, which shouldn't be the case. By allowing some of these modifications to land tenure, that ensures that Indigenous people can participate in the economy. Indigenous people are not going anywhere. We are going to be here. We have something to provide to Canada and the GDP. We have more than $100 billion opportunity. Per capita, we should be at $75 billion right now. We're not anywhere near that. We're about $30 billion in the last study that was done. But if we support the mechanism of economic development for Indigenous communities, including capital, business support services, and making sure that we have the right institutions in place, then Indigenous people will provide prosperity for Canada, because we're growing at 4 times the Canadian average. And a lot of our youth don't have opportunities in this country. We're going to have 1 million Indigenous youth by 2027. Let's make sure that they have a job, they have a business, they have opportunities so that they can contribute to the economy. Thank you.
Quite simply, do you think that the creation of urban reserves in municipalities across Canada would add to the economic growth of those municipalities and Canada in general?
Yeah, if you look at any of the leakage studies that are done with centers like Thunder Bay, Saskatoon, and all the major centers that support Indigenous communities that are in the north or around it, you'll see that there is a large amount of money that is creating an economy, and communities are already buying up land near urban centers. If we can improve that process of transferring it to reserve, then all of a sudden you're going to have a hub of business. You'll see Saskatoon, some of the communities have land all around Saskatoon, and you're seeing that all across the country. If we made it a little bit easier for them to do it, they want to invest because they want to be close to the market. They want to hire their people who are moving to the urban centers. They can create services and products. Thank you.
I guess my last question with about a minute left. Shannon, you talked about land as capital. Now, one of the emerging themes that we've heard consistently from Indigenous witnesses is that they see land as more than just a capital asset to be property, to be accessed for funds. They see it as more of something that they're connected to, that they feel like a stewardship of it. How would you manage to use land as a form of capital for loans when communities don't want that land to be removed from the connection to those Indigenous communities? Is there a way that we can do that innovatively where the land acts as capital without the further separation from Indigenous communities from their lands?
I think there's a balance, and I think you just want an opportunity to be able to plan from it. If every society in all of the world can't be wealthy without land, and having no land for Indigenous people to plan from is not a really fair thing to have. If land is embedded in our culture, and we are the land, and we're the protectors of the land. But when there's poverty in your land, you want to be able to utilize and have a plan to utilize some of that land to benefit your community and for future generations. We're the stewards of that land, so we were provided that. That's our generational wealth in the land. But we've been spectators as our generational wealth has been eroded. So our natural capital has been eroded, and everybody else gets prosperous from our lands. We're just asking for a share of that prosperity. We will be able to manage that land. We'll be able to balance environmental stewardship and prosperity for our people. Thank you.
Is there any numbers that you can show? I just want to be able to really, is there anything that you can show us that says that if we invest in these things, that they will create growth with kind of some kind of certainty or some kind of numbers that back that up? Because I'd really love to have that tabled for the final report of this, showing that when you invest in returning land to Indigenous people, whether it's a municipality, whether it's in key areas, that the economic growth comes with that, and that's something that Canadians shouldn't be scared of.
And I'll just say we'll need a brief answer. We're almost at the end of the 6 minutes, but I'll give you a chance to
I
respond.
don't have any numbers. You're asking for a specific number. I'd say look at history, but maybe
I don't have any numbers either.
I don't have any numbers for that, but you just have to look at history by the indicator of a half or 3/4 of all wealth being derived from the land. And if we don't have any land, then we're never going to see that wealth. There's definitely going to be an increase in wealth for the community if we're able to manage our own lands.
If you do find any documents, table them.
I will. I will. And I'm providing this National Indigenous Economic Strategy with some great recommendations.
Perfect, thank you. We go now to Madame Gill, who will have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much to Mr. Matatawaben and Mr. King for coming here today. I would like to have some information from Mr. King, who talked about the work in Lemthak. Maybe I'll wait until he puts on his headset. All right. Since I was speaking to Mr. King, I wanted to wait until he got the interpretation. With regard to his work with MBAC, he talked about the fact that the procedures, the ATR process, was inadequate, and perhaps there should be something different. You mentioned co-management and national centre, for example. So first of all, I was wondering whether you could give us an overview of these procedures that actually fail and why. And afterwards, maybe you can give us a description of some possible solutions and explain why they would help. And obviously, if you don't have time to answer, you can send your answers in writing to the committee.
Sure. Well, the additions to reserve policy in particular, I think, has been criticized pretty roundly at this committee. I think people take a lot of issue with the length to which it takes to add fee simple land to reserve status. I think it's costly. I think there's the negotiations that have to take place with municipalities. First Nations don't really like the idea of having to pay tax on their own land back to municipalities when you do transfer land back to reserve status. But I think in principle, there's also an issue that we're not really addressing, or very few people are addressing. Excuse me. And that's when you need, to transfer reserve land, sorry. So let's say you have submitted a land claim and you have earned some restitution in the form of financial compensation. So you take that money from your stolen land and you purchase land, and then you vest title in that land back to the federal government. I don't know what's going on in my throat here today. So you just basically, the land that's been stolen from you, you've bought back, and then you turn around and you give it back to the federal government. You give title back to the federal government, who then transfers it to reserve status. Yeah, thank you. I had to do some water. I should take a drink. And so it seems like a very strange philosophy and approach to land back, that where you're basically you finally have your land back, and now you're giving it to the federal government to manage throughout this two-decade long process to, you know, maybe have tax-free status, like a limited labor and environmental regulations on economic development initiatives, whether they're urban or rural based. I mean, that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me, and I think it may perhaps provoke some conversation about a different model of land tenure that Indigenous people can hold, that maybe is not just the fee simple model that requires taxes, and is maybe not the reserve model that requires the transfer of title. I think in all of the work that's been done over the past decade to revise the additions to reserve policy, I'm somewhat shocked that a different type of model hasn't been innovated that would allow Indigenous people to maintain fee simple land ownership without the onerous taxation requirements. Specific and comprehensive land claims processes, I think, are also have been at this committee widely criticized. I think the specific land claims process requires First Nations to subscribe to a often federal or provincial interpretation of historic treaties before they can even enter into a discussion of restitution. I think it was in 2015 a Liberal government actually proposed a national discussion on treaty implementation. That never came to pass, but it would be useful to have a conversation about what we actually mean by Treaty Number 3 or Treaty 6 or Treaty 9. Like, why is there such an unwillingness to sit down and discuss what we actually mean when we say we're all treaty people? Well, my interpretation of the treaty is different from your interpretation of the treaty, and we have never crossed that Rubicon to figure out where the consensus is, if there is such a thing. And so instead, we have to fight it out in specific and of course, comprehensive land claim processes, and the latter are based on the principle of extinguishment. You can only enter into those processes if you agree to extinguish your title on the land or not assert your rights to provide the federal government or provinces or territories with certainty. And I think that's why the comprehensive claims process is grinding to such a halt in the last decade, since 2013. And I think, what else did I mention? Specific comprehensive land claim agreements, additions to reserve policy. Inadequate. Yeah.
Perhaps, Mr. Chairman, if I could add the following. Mr. King, if you have any other suggestions that we didn't have a chance to talk about, if you have something to add, please send the information to our committee. It would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Now we'll go to Ms. Idlut, who will have 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chip. I have a question for Mr. Hayden King. I'm sorry I can't see you in person. I've been very proud of you and the work you've been doing. The question I have is associated with the book you wrote in 2019. The organization you work for, Yellowhead Institute, Red Paper. The book has very impressed me. If we're going to have our own government, our rights, we need to focus on our rights. Can you please elaborate how we're going to use our rights to ATR, 2 line back. Okay.
Words.
Merci pour votre.
Aboriginal rights in this country are very limited. They're very narrow. Section 35 Aboriginal rights afford us the ability to do what? To hunt, fish, and gather. I mean, this is not the conception of rights that Indigenous people had in mind when our ancestors agreed to share the land with Canadians, or not the rights that we exercised prior to the establishment of this place, Canada. And as I said, provide very few avenues for us to express rights in any contemporary way. I mean, courts have routinely frozen Indigenous people in the past in terms of the expression of rights. I think the one area that there is some innovation is on title, in particular the 2013 Chilcotin or Salcotin case that vested interest, a management interest, an economic interest in jurisdictional potential among First Nations that can prove title to their land. I think that's an additional reason why we see less communities moving through the comprehensive lands claims processes. If the court recognizes that there's a managerial stake and interest in the land, in title lands that is, why would you go through a claims process that extinguishes those rights? You wouldn't. That's silly. And so instead, communities are starting to look to unique and novel models that actually are not connected to any federal policy or any federal legislation to begin animating Aboriginal title in their own ways. And I think the example on the West Coast with what the Haida are doing and what the Chilcotin are doing really reflects an Indigenous-led, Indigenous imagined approach to Aboriginal title that isn't necessarily tied to Section 35 Aboriginal rights. I mean, I think we often, as Indigenous people, get caught up in this belief that we're bound by Canadian law and policy, but that's not necessarily the case, right? We have our own law, we have our own approaches to our relationship to the land, and we can assert and enforce jurisdiction on that land using those laws. And in fact, we're starting to see that Canadian law is providing maybe the shade or the contour to have a dialogue about where those laws meet. And I think that that was a really powerful element of the 2013 court decision. And so the answer to your question is entirely on the side of Indigenous people, or rather it is up to Indigenous people to enforce our interpretation of our rights in practice on the land, and it's less about what a court decides or a government decides, in fact.
Thank you for answering me clearly. As a First Nation, Indigenous people, if we're going to continue with this, people that I sit with on this, how the lawmakers of all Canada, how can we, First Nations, there, how can, as Inuit First Nations, get tukisimatsiang ito alora mailan yung ito lori?
Lose my time. The interpreter wasn't grasping what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, Lori, I'll go ahead and rephrase your question, and then we'll hear an answer, and then we'll conclude this panel.
Okay, thank you. So I really appreciate your response, because this can't only be about giving space to Indigenous peoples to ensure that we are implementing land back. My question is, as parliamentarians, we see that there's the court case way, which doesn't always work because, as you said, it gives us narrow rights. But as parliamentarians, what can we do to better recognize the existence of Indigenous people's rights to things like land back? Because it's not just about economic development, it's not just about education. Land back is very much about asserting Indigenous jurisdiction, reasserting those rights. And do you have any recommendations that parliamentarians can consider so that as we're making laws that impact Canada, that we could use these tools to implement a better way to ensure that land back is happening?
You know, I think that thank you for the question, because I think it is remarkable to me how little time and space has been spent on defining Aboriginal rights through a legislative agenda. I mean, Aboriginal rights have only been defined by the courts. Courts have, by degrees, expanded the principle and the concept of Aboriginal rights after conflict between First Nations, Métis, or Inuit and federal or provincial governments. And so this narrow and limited conception of rights is in some ways maybe by design because of an unwillingness of the federal government to actually articulate how it views Aboriginal rights, what are included in Aboriginal rights. If we were to write a list of the Aboriginal rights, I mean, how many lawmakers could, I don't know, list 3 or 4 or 5, or what Aboriginal rights should be? That lack of dialogue on the conception of Aboriginal rights is, as I said, somewhat remarkable. And so that discussion isn't really happening. Maybe it's happening in this committee, I don't know. Now, it's potentially problematic for parliamentarians to pass a law that describes what the scope and content of Aboriginal rights are without the discussion and consent of Indigenous people, but why not have that conversation? And I think that word in particular, consent, is a useful one because, as I said in my opening remarks, I feel that it is a conversation that is emerging and proliferating around the country, and it is a tool that communities are using increasingly to assert and enforce their vision of land management, land restitution, and self-government, self-determination. So perhaps there's an avenue through which to pursue the work that has already been done by the federal government around the United Nations Declaration Act implementation plan and build on the concept of free, prior, and informed consent, allowing communities to decide for themselves at a local level and perhaps regional level what land back means to them. And so those are two possible avenues.
Okay, thank you. And colleagues and witnesses, unfortunately, that takes us to the end of our first round. We're going to have to suspend now so we can bring in our next panel, and that takes a couple of minutes to do. But Mr. Manitowoban and Mr. King, thank you so much for being here today. As was mentioned a couple of times, I know, Mr. Manitowoban, you said you have a document to leave behind. If you have anything further, or Mr. King, that you'd like to send to us, we're in the final phase of our study here. We're going to be moving into report writing soon, so but we can accept up to an additional 10 pages of testimony. And we really appreciate your being here today and the insights that you've shared. So with that, colleagues, we're suspended. We'll be back as quickly as we can. Session. And just before we get started, we had another slight technical issue related to receiving and distributing a notice of motion from our colleague, Mr. Zimmer. And so I have indicated I will give him, he's going to read it out in English. It will be interpreted, obviously, by our team. And then we're waiting for a official translated version. There is an issue with the translation. And so we will get that circulated so everybody will have the bilingual ones in hard copy, but the oral version is accepted for giving notice. And so we'll get Mr. Zimmer to read out his notice. But before I do that, I'll go to Madam Gillow, who I guess might have a point of order.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I imagine that the interpreters didn't receive the French version either.
If it's in English and presented orally.
C'est eux qui me signifient qu'ils n'ont pas le texte présentement.
Yes, the interpreters are saying that we have not received the text in French either. English. We have not received the text in English or in French.
Although we've just received the proper version we are waiting for, so our clerk will distribute that to everybody right now, including the interpreters. But I'll call on Mr. Zimmer to read his notion, and then we're going to get into hearing from our witnesses. Madame Gill, does that work? You'll have it in a second. And Ms. Idloot, I'll go to you.
Thank you, Chair. Can we not discuss the motion at the next session after it's been given in both official languages? That way we're not taking time away from our witnesses.
Yeah, procedurally, if it had been distributed in both languages before 4 o'clock, it would be in order for the 48 hours notice. There was, like I say, a technical piece. That's why I'm trying to dispense with this very quickly so we can get into the witnesses.
It'll take me to.
Yeah, so I'm going to go to Bob to read it out. It'll be distributed to everyone, so you'll have it. And then I'm going to move on to our welcoming Ms. Baer, who's patiently waiting for us, and we'll get going with our opening statements and questions. So, Mr. Zimmer, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate it. The motion that it be reported to the House that the committee supports the development of the gas export project KSI Lisms LNG, which will build a 12 million metric ton a year LNG facility and contribute to economic reconciliation with the Nisga'a Nation and contribute economic benefits to communities in northern BC, and that the committee ask the government to remove all necessary regulatory roadblocks to this project and allow KSI LSI MS, just for spelling, LNG to move forward expeditiously. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. So that has been or is being distributed. Everybody will have it. And that's just putting it on notice, so there's no debate on it. And now we're ready to move in. So Ms. Baer, welcome. And please correct me if I if I mispronounce your nation. Ochapawase, or maybe can you introduce your First Nation for us?
Ochapawase.
Oh, okay, Ochapawase. So welcome to our committee today. You'll have 5 minutes now for an opening statement, and then we'll get into a round of 6-minute questions for each of the parties. And that may be about as much time as we have for our discussion today. So when you're ready, Ms. Baer, the floor is yours.
Okay. I would like to thank you for Kakishuwe Ochapawase Nation to appear as a witness on this very important hearing regarding the restitution of land to First Nations. My name is Ogama Esqueo Chalier Bear, Chief of our nation. I've been involved in First Nations politics for decades in different capacities, as well as have had the opportunity to be passed on much of our oral histories of our peoples. The Kakishuwe Ochapawase Nation is a signatory to Treaty 4. Prior to that, our peoples date back hundreds of years living off these lands provided by the Creator. We lived by hunting, fishing, trapping, trading, and maintaining our way of life on extensive tracts of land throughout parts of what we now call Canada and the United States. Treaty 4, signed by our leaders in the Crown, unequivocally promised that by agreeing to share this land, we would maintain our way of life, and everything else negotiated was on top of what we already had. This was to be enjoyed by Kakshioeo and his peoples to ensure our posterity forever. I want to share what took place during Treaty 4 negotiations in 1874, passed on to me by my late grandfather and late Chief Richard Poorman. Chief Kakshioeo and Chief Kawakatus carried sacks of dirt and placed them on the negotiating table. Chief Kawakatus then asked Treaty Commissioner Morris how many sacks of money he brought, and stated that for each sack of money, they could have a sack of dirt in exchange. The chiefs went on to strongly assert that this country is not for sale. Of course, this never made it into the treaty transcripts, but this exchange has been passed down through the generations. These words illustrate our ancestors' deep connections to the lands and how such an idea of selling our lands or country was a concept our people couldn't grasp. It also illustrates how our words during treaty deliberations were either misunderstood, misinterpreted, or totally struck from the transcripts. And this is why our present leaders understand things differently. And I'm referring to the agreement to share the land to the depth of a plow. These words were also struck from the transcripts of treaty as understood by our peoples. So when Canada transferred the administration of lands and resources to the prairie provinces in 1930 through the Natural Resource Transfer Agreement, the First Nations people of the prairie provinces were not consulted or even informed. The NRTA resulted in an incredible breach of our treaties, a breach that was unlawful back in 1930 and is still unlawful today. The exercise of our right to hunt, fish, trap, and gather is fundamental to the treaty promises that were made to First Nations. So without our lands and resources, the exercise of our rights will be gone, as will our traditions, ceremonies, and languages. When the Crown came upon our lands, they used the doctrine of discovery, which allowed the Crown to claim sovereignty over our lands. This doctrine means when a nation discovers land, it directly acquires rights to that land. But there are many First Nations on Turtle Island who were not discovered. These doctrines need to be put to rest, and they continue to oppress our nations. And this oppression is evident in the province's Saskatchewan's First Act, Saskatchewan's unlawful assertion of jurisdiction over lands and resources that rightfully belong to First Nations. The Sask First Act is a direct threat to our inherent treaty and constitutional rights, especially when the province says they have exclusive jurisdiction over the natural resources within our treaty and traditional territories. Canada was built on First Nations land. This country has benefited from the colonization of our peoples in many ways, and most notably, in terms of the theft of our lands and our bountiful resources. In order for our nations to truly become sovereign and able to provide for our citizens, we need our land back. In the words of Jody Wilson-Raybould, true reconciliation can be broken down into 3 steps: learn, understand, and act. First Nations have been studied and analyzed for decades, and yet we are still plagued with poverty, addiction, and despair. What we need today is for Canada and mainstream society to learn about what we need. We need mainstream government leaders, their government bureaucrats, and Canadian society to understand our rights and why we have a special relationship with the Crown. First Nations don't keep asking for handouts like many in this country believe. We want what is rightfully ours. We want to establish and maintain respectful relationships with our neighbors. We need for Canada to understand that the rights we negotiated under treaty need to be respected. And until those rights are respected, we cannot achieve true reconciliation. finally, we need Canada, mainstream society, and First Nations to act. We need to put our words into action and deliver on the promises made under treaty. We need to work to that end in order for our nations to benefit and be truly equal to other Canadians. We want our children and grandchildren to have a fighting chance in our country. We deserve that. Our children and grandchildren deserve that, and we owe them that. The colonial practices of the past cannot continue. We need to redefine our relationship with each other and work toward true reconciliation. To me, reconciliation is land back that is fair and justified, because without the land, we have no home or no way to exercise our rights and pass down our sacred teachings to our children and grandchildren and those yet to come. Thank you for allowing me to be on the agenda today.
Thank you, Chief Bear, for your opening comments. We're going to go right into our first round. So, Mr. Vierson, I have you first. You'll have 6 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I think I'd just like to move the motion that I put on notice a while back around the losses of churches in the communities in my riding and around the country. I've read that motion into the record a few days or a few meetings back, and I just would like to get that motion to come to a vote yet today. It doesn't ask for a study or anything like that. It just asks for a report to the House, and I think we can get that done here today. We've seen over 80 church buildings have been reported burnt in this country. Most of these have been on First Nation reserves, were used by local Indigenous people. And these losses of church buildings have been devastating to these communities, which these churches are places of life milestones, weddings, funerals, baptisms, that sort of thing. Community members have come to me and said, showed their displeasure for this.
Point of order.
Alan Adam of the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation.
Okay, just a second, Mr. Vierson. Ms. Edloot, your point of order, please.
I remember that we had agreed that we wouldn't discuss that motion until after the study.
Okay, it is a motion that's in order, and Mr. Vierson has the floor. The clock is running, and I'm going to stop the clock for a second. We had this discussion last time about moving motion, and I'm going to just give everybody. Bosch and Gagnon actually addressed the issue, and for reference sake, it is Chapter 12, page 565, first sentence of the second paragraph indicates the moving of a motion which does not require notice typically ends the speech in which it is included, and that principle tends to carry through in other committees I've been at, where if a motion is raised during the slide time, we'll go until the motion is debated and dispensed with. But if we run out of time, then the next speaking slot goes to the next party.
Okay.
So that's how we're going to proceed for this. But you do have still 4.5 minutes,
okay.
And so the floor remains yours until we dispense with this.
Super. I just wanted to get Chief Alan Adam of the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation on the record here when he said that he was devastated to watch their church burn in his community. Where are we going to go now for funerals, ask for prayers? This should have never happened. It was uncalled for. Over the summer, one of the oldest churches in Alberta was burnt down at Greward, St. Bernard's Church, and I would really like to just recognize that, give our condolences as a committee to that community, and make sure that this doesn't happen any longer in Canada. It's outrageous that churches are being burnt down across the country. So if I can read my motion once again, that it be reported to the House that the committee condemn the arson and attacks of over 80 churches across Canada, and in particular extend their condolences to the community of Greward and Capuino First Nation with the loss of St. Bernard's Church, one of the oldest churches in Alberta, a piece of history, the building that holds memories for generations of community members, and that the committee reaffirm freedom of religion and assembly and call on those responsible for these attacks to be brought to justice. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Vierson. So we'll go through the speaking list that I have. First up, I have Mr. Batiste, and then I have Mr. Batiste, Mr. Carr, Mr. Keurig, Mr. Pawlowski, and Madame Gill. So that's the speaking order we have.
You know, I think that what has happened over, the past few years with reconciliation and with churches and with the Pope coming to apologize, there's a deep need for reflection and reconciliation. But I really want to get to the end of this study, and I would have, I know that we've called adjourn to debate on this. I would like to call it adjourn to debate on this if that's what we can do so we can hear the rest of the study. But if we have to, then I would have rather discussed this in camera, because it does have a way of triggering a lot of people who went through Indian residential schools and the things that they're going through. I wouldn't want to have this in camera, but if you're going to force a vote on this right now, then I'd like to call it to a vote with us voting against.
Okay, I just need to clarify because I've heard two things. One of them is to adjourn debate, and one is to call the vote. Yeah, two very different. So the adjourn debate is a motion that is required to be acted on without hearing any further speakers. And if we do the vote, then I have my speakers list I do need to get through.
Okay, well, then I vote to adjourn the debate.
Okay, so then we'll call the question on that. So do we want it recorded, or can we just do a show of hands? Okay.
Mr. Batiste?
I'm voting to adjourn debate.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Carr?
In favor of adjournment.
Ms. Gainey? Mr. Hanley?
In favor.
Mr. Pawlowski?
In favor.
Mr. Schmale?
Against.
Mr. Keurig?
Against.
Mr. Viersen? Against. Mr. Zimmer?
Against.
Madame Gill?
In favor.
Ms. Idlout?
Anyak po nga in favor.
I'm going to
Sorry,
give.
I didn't hear Ms. Idlout's vote. If I could hear Ms. Idlout's vote.
Anyak po nga.
In favor.
In favor? Okay.
And Madame Gill, would you like to recast your vote en français? Okay. Okay.
7 yeas, 4 nays.
So debate is adjourned, and we will then continue on with our questions. So there's still 21 seconds on the clock. Mr. Viersen, the floor is yours.
Point of order, Chair. Yes. So according to Bosch and Gagnon, I believe that from the moment that the motion was moved, the clock would have been paused, and then it would be restarted with the amount of time that Mr. Viersen had left.
No, that's a discussion that we had last week, and I indicated that we would come forward with the ruling, and so the ruling that I've made is that the clock does not stop. The person has the duration of their questioning, the period for questioning, and if it hits the end, which we just did, it goes to the next person. Mr. Viersen.
Well, just on that point of order, when you read Boskin Gagnon to us, you said that motion without notice, but my motion had notice. So maybe perhaps you should review that. I will cede the rest of my time at this point, but just review that.
Okay, point taken.
My motion was with notice.
Yeah, and I realized that, and I said it's a principle that has been carried forward to committees for motions with notice as well. So it's just a way of keeping the dialogue going, but I appreciate you ceding the floor. We will go on to Mr. Batiste. We'll have 6 minutes, and I will go back to work with the clerk to revisit that, and the next time it comes up, we'll give you my decision. Thank you. Mr. Batiste, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chief Bear, for bearing with us through that administrative discussion. My question is, you talked about where we are in terms of Saskatchewan. In a lot of the number treaties, it is my understanding that while land was discussed, there was not a good translation done where the nations fully understood the English version of the treaties. Is that your understanding of the treaties as well, the number treaties?
Yes, it is. Like I said, I know I've been, spent a lot of time working and reviewing, and not only that, had the opportunity to be passed on that oral history of my musham Marlo Kanawashkoham, who was raised by his grandfather, who was at the signing of Treaty 4. Kakshiweo, who was the first signatory to Treaty 4, the first one to step up and touch the pen for the signing of Treaty 4, was one of my I'm a direct descendant of, so a lot of that history has been passed on. I worked for 16 years with the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations as well, and spent a lot of time, like I had mentioned earlier, the late Chief Richard Poorman, late Chief Denton George, very strong, late Chief Irvin Starblanket, I had the opportunity to spend a lot of time with, and these have always been the discussions that have taken place over the years that I had the opportunity to sit with them.
Thank you for that. And I'm wondering if you could speak to a little about, we've heard from the Office of the Treaty Commission from Saskatchewan talk about the treaty land entitlements and how they worked with First Nations in Saskatchewan to try to give some of this land back. I'm wondering if you could tell us how you feel that process unfolded and what were the successes around that or failures of that program.
Well, again, it goes back to treaty and what our ancestors, signed. Yes, we signed for land to be set aside. And I shouldn't even be saying set aside. It was always our land. We had never given it up. But it was a land sectioned out for us, for our people to have posterity. Today, unfortunately, we're in a case where Ochapwace is two treaty bands that were amalgamated by the Indian agent in 1881, unilaterally. Canada was found guilty of breach of treaty, so we're in the process of reconstituting one of those nations back to its original place. But we look at the amount of land that we have, and we look at the survival and of our population for the future. The amount of land that we have is never going to be enough for our people when we move farther into the future. And that's where I go back, that it was meant to be for our future generations to prosper. And I don't think when they gave us 46,000 acres of land in 1876 or 1878 that was surveyed, that they knew that was going to be enough land for our people to prosper on. And again, it wasn't, we talk about the TLE. Yes, there has been problems with it. We are a TLE band here in Saskatchewan. We never received our loss of use for those lands over the years. We received enough to purchase back those acres of land that we weren't given rightfully under treaty. But it makes things hard when you have the Saskatchewan government putting up crown lands for auction when we haven't even acquired our shortfall acres for treaty. And that goes back again to the Sask First Act and what they're doing here in Saskatchewan. With what's going on here, I don't know if we'll ever be able to achieve shortfall. Our First Nations here, our First Nation itself in Saskatchewan, which is the Kakshiweo and the Chekachas treaty bands, due to those policies that they put in place where they can auction off crown lands without any consultation whatsoever.
Chief Barry, I think I got a minute left. A lot of the testimony we've heard so far talked about, just what you're talking about, the future generations and how we can create prosperity within First Nations communities. A lot of them have done really well with urban reserves and moving forward with economic development that creates capacity, that creates growth. Do you think this is something that should be done more in Saskatchewan?
Yes, and I know we do a lot of it in Saskatchewan. We do have urban lands that have been transferred to treaty lands. Wouldn't say too urban, but we're on the outskirts of Regina, just a couple minutes out. And we've had the opportunity to purchase those lands back in the 1990s, actually, early 1990s. We have businesses started on those lands that our urban members or off reserve members can enjoy. So no, it's about sharing in these resources at the end of the day, so that we can be equal and even more prosperous.
Thank you.
I
Chief
don't
Bear,
think it was. Yep.
I'm going to have to jump in. We're at the end of the 6 minutes, and I still have two members who need to get to their questions. So unfortunately, we have to stop there. I'm going to go now to Madame Gill. Vous avez 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will speak French, if you don't mind. Thank you to all of our witnesses. Mr. Roy and Ms. Bear, I hope that, Mr. Roy, you are going to send your testimony to us. And as our chair mentioned, it would be greatly appreciated. Ms. Bear, I would have liked to have heard you talk about the impacts that with regard to the delays with the ATR policy and the different programs in your area. I was wondering what kind of recommendations you could make to this committee with regard to the restitution of lands.
Yes, we did.
Okay, I'm stopping the clock. J'ai terminé la cloche.
I've stopped the clock.
So.
Just Chair, if I could, just to highlight the dynamics that so many rural and remote Canadians face when it comes to internet and connectivity. Certainly, that's emphasized, and for those watching, to note that this is an ongoing challenge that I know so many Canadians, the 10% of Canada that lives outside of a major urban centre, have to deal with on a regular basis. So just a note for those many, sometimes connectivity issues affect not only those who are trying to do basic things like school and work in small towns and remote villages, but also those who are trying to participate in Canada's political and parliamentary processes as well.
You raise a very good point, and that gives me an opportunity to speak to the significant investments that the government is making in increasing rural broadband across the country and to make sure that all Canadians are connected. But thank you for the opportunity to raise that. Madame Gill, did you have a point of order?
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In fact, I just wanted to ask whether we were going to suspend the meeting while waiting until these technical matters are resolved.
A good idea. We'll suspend until we get the sound back. Suspended. And because of this technical issue, we are at the end of the meeting time. We were going to be moving into drafting instruction at this point. So I apologize to Madame Gell and Ms. Idlut, but we have no witness left online. So we're going to end this portion of the meeting, and then we'll move in camera for the next part of the meeting. So Ms. Idlut, you should have the new link for moving to the in camera meeting. So I'll invite you to, we'll close off this meeting now, the public meeting, and we'll give you a minute to get into the new link and to join us in camera. And Mr. Roy, thank you so much for sitting in with us today. I really apologize that things didn't work, and I think it raises the question of technology for many Indigenous communities and rural areas, as Mr. Couric mentioned, and that's why our government is working on it. So with that, folks, we're suspended. We'll be back in camera in a few minutes.
Thank you.